Beautiful souls, welcome, welcome. I want to tell you about something that I have made just for you. I'm really excited about it. And I say made because that is literally what this is. It's all homemade. I didn't outsource this. I didn't hire someone to just slap it together. It's not some random recipe list. I sat down and I wrote the Essential Canning Cookbook from my own kitchen with my own hands, years and years of trial and error and tons of sticky countertops and sealed jars that are cooling on the rack at midnight. And why I'm bringing it up before this particular episode is because today we are going to be talking about what happens when we stop passing skills down to our kids. What gets lost? What gets lost in translation? And one of the biggest things that I see disappearing is the confidence to preserve our own food. So people used to can, much like the way that we brush our teeth today. It was just part of the rhythm of a household. And somewhere along the way, it became this very intimidating, scary thing to do. And people feel like they need some sort of a degree to be able to do it. The Essential Canning Cookbook was built to actually fix that problem because it walks you through everything. Water bath canning, pressure canning, jams, pickles, salsas, broth, sauces, step by step with the kind of language that actually makes sense when you're standing in your kitchen with a pot of peaches and your hands are already sticky. So if today's episode lights something up in you, if it makes you want to start building a pantry with your kids so that your kids can see and touch and be proud of the stuff that you guys are making, this cookbook is the best place for you to begin. I want you to head over to wilderspace.com, grab your copy, and let's get your kitchen pantry going today. I want to welcome you to the Sovereign Kitchen Society. I am Molly Bravo, and if you're new here, this is where we talk about real food, real life, and all of the stuff that nobody seems to be saying out loud. If you've been here a while, then you already know the deal. I just want you to pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, and let's get into it. Today's episode is one that I have been carrying around with me for a while, and I have titled it, If We Don't Teach Them, Then It Ends With Us. And I want to warn you up front that this is probably going to resonate with you. You're probably going to pay attention and you're probably going to think twice about what you're doing with your family in your kitchen right now. And I think that is wonderful. I hope that that happens because this particular idea and concept sat with me for a few weeks and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to present it to you. The thing that I keep circling back to, the thing that kind of sits heavy with me is that in just 2 short generations, we have literally stopped teaching our children how to live. And I'm not talking about how to find a job or fill out a college application. I'm talking about kids do not know how to feed themselves. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They do not have practical, real life skills. We are not teaching them. So how do we keep a house running? How do we teach them to feel competent in their own skills and feel safe enough to ask questions if they don't know how to do something so that if, for example, the power were to go out, they would know how to prepare a meal or they would know how to gather wood to make a fire. I think that if we do not start rebuilding these skills with our children deliberately in our own homes with our hands, then the chain is probably going to end up breaking with our particular generation. And that's kind of scary to think about. I grew up in Saratoga. It's a tiny little town in California. I grew up in the 1980s. It was a small town and it had like really quiet streets. And it was the kind of place where you could just leave in the morning and nobody even questioned where you were going and they didn't expect you back until after dinner. We've kind of all heard those stories on social media lately, reflecting on the nostalgia. And so I'm going to reflect on my childhood for just a minute. If you can just go back to the early 1980s when there's no technology, you have nothing to do all day long. It's summertime. It's hot. Your parents are at work. The only thing that you have are your friends, a bicycle, and your imagination. So what would happen? We would typically go and meet up with our friends, and then we would end up going to this house next door to mine. It was an old abandoned house. And in this house, before it became abandoned, there was a family of 10 that lived there. And that family of 10 homeschooled their kids. They had a kiln that was built into the ground in the backyard. They grew all their own food. They preserved their food. They homeschooled their kids on the back porch. All the kids slept in one room. The parents slept in another room. And it was like this free-for-all, super fun, hippie commune kind of an environment, a great place for kids. What ended up happening is that family ended up moving out. The house became abandoned. My best friend Marisa and I took it over. We would go ghost hunting, exploring, redecorate. It was just a wonderful childhood. The thing is that we were bored, right? Like we had nothing to do during the summer. And so because we were bored and we had nothing to do, we got creative, we got inventive, and we actually built our own competence. So like when we were bored and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do, we would go explore. And if we didn't know the answers to something, we would try to figure it out. We didn't have anybody to ask questions to about how to do things. So what I want you to understand about the 80s and even the 70s before that is that kids were left to their own devices. They were left to grow up relatively quickly. They would come home from school. They would make their own snacks. They didn't have tutorials. They didn't have YouTube videos. They would open up the refrigerator. They would find something to make. They would figure out how to make it. Maybe it was crackers and cheese. Maybe it was a weird sandwich. Maybe they would burn something on the stove. But you know what? We would all learn super fast how to pay attention the next time. So that's how we learned. That's how we gained confidence. We used our hands and we learned along the way. Nobody was there to do it for us. So now I want to take you back even further. And I want to take you back to the 1940s, and nearly half of the produce that was consumed in America was grown at home. Victory gardens were everywhere, and these were pretty serious plots of land that families tended to, and they tended to these gardens together because they understood that gardens fed families and that families could tend those gardens and it would build community, and everybody had a role. Everybody contributed. That is how a home economy works. Canning was a very ordinary skill. It was as ordinary as doing the laundry. So your grandmother obviously didn't take a class on how to can. She learned how to can from her mother, and her mother learned from her mother, and so on. By standing next to someone who already knew how to do those skills, and by standing next to somebody and paying attention, that was considered apprenticeship. And in these 2 short generations, we have almost killed that. I think about my own family. I think about the kitchen that I grew up in Saratoga. It wasn't a fancy kitchen. It was cluttered. There were always dishes in the sink, but there was always something on the stove. And there was this unspoken understanding that the kitchen was the center of the home. I'm sure you've heard that before. It was the center of the home, not the house. That is where all of the conversation took place. That's where you figured out if your sister was pregnant or if your uncle had lost his job. It was all over a family cooked dinner. The kids were always running around. We weren't sent off into another room to play. We were always right underneath our parents, cooking in that kitchen, getting in the way, sneaking tastes of things. And it was exactly the way that it was supposed to be. I think before World War II, the USDA estimated that American households were preserving over 4 billion jars of food a year. 4 billion. And after the war, when the industrial food system took off and supermarkets became the new normal, that number ended up dropping off a cliff with a single generation. So we went from 4 billion jars to families who have never even seen a canning lid. That is pretty freaking fast. And the thing about losing skills like that is that we obviously don't feel the effects right away. It is just that one day our kids end up waking up and they don't even know how to make a pot of rice. One day your daughter calls you in a panic because the power's out and she doesn't know how to feed her kids without electricity. One day an adult posts online that they're embarrassed because they can't host Thanksgiving dinner without ordering everything pre-made from someone else. And I happen to see it all the time because I'm in the food industry, because I cook for a living, I'm a caterer, and people will message me on social media and they'll leave comments and leave me little DMs talking about how they're embarrassed that they don't know how to cook. They're embarrassed that they don't know how to make a pot of broth. So I just want to remind you that it's nothing to be embarrassed of. It's just that you were never taught. And now you have the opportunity to learn and you have the opportunity to pass that information on to your kids so that they learn those skills. I'm going to take you a step deeper now, because this goes beyond just recipes and knowing how to cook. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about science that I think is going to help change your perception of your own kitchen. So when a toddler insists on pouring their own water and they spill half of it all over the counter, there's a moment when you might feel frustrated. And what I want you to remember is that they are just trying to master their own environment. They're wired for competence. Every child is wired for competence. And so when we let them practice and when we let them fail, when we let them try again, then something gets rewired in their brain. That competence that we were talking about actually ends up building confidence. And the confidence is what psychologists call agency. Agency is the feeling that you have an effect over your own life, that your actions actually matter, and that you're not just along for the ride, but you get to grow up with agency and become an adult who doesn't freak out when hard things happen. You don't freeze, you don't panic, you don't know what to do because nobody ever told you what to do. It's the same thing with our kids. We are teaching them agency so that they can grow up to be productive members of society. I'm going to talk to you about Weston A. Price for just a second. And if you don't know his work, he was a dentist in the 1930s who traveled the world studying indigenous populations and their diets. One of the patterns that he found over and over again was that a child was deeply integrated into the food system of their community. They cooked, they tended animals, they preserved food alongside adults. They were not separated into a kid world with kid food and kid entertainment like we do in this day and age. They were all part of the household. They were all part of that home economy. They had real jobs with real consequences if they did not do those jobs. And the communities embraced the children, and the children ended up having these very strong teeth and bones and wide dental arches, and they had a very calm nervous system. All of this was documented by Weston Price. He photographed it, he wrote about it extensively, and then he watched what ended up happening with those same communities, raising those same kids, when Western processed food was brought into the equation. And then in one generation, all of their teeth narrowed, the bones weakened, their health declined, and it only took one generation. That's pretty crazy. So I'm going to bring that home to the kitchen because something happens when a child works with food. And I'm talking about slow food. So we're not talking about microwaving a frozen burrito. I'm talking about when kids are shelling peas on the porch, or they're stirring a pot of broth that's been simmering all morning long, or watching cabbage as it slowly transforms into sauerkraut. These are all tasks that kids back then learned that actually calmed the nervous system and helped them learn agency. They were practicing repetitive motions, the smell, the warmth, the waiting. All of that teaches a child that they're safe, that the world is moving slowly enough that they can actually keep up. And I don't think that in this day and age, we even think about that. In a world where everything is buzzing and pinging and moving so fast and demanding our attention, it is exhausting. So how do you think our kids feel trying to keep up, trying to learn? It's impossible to do. It's overwhelming. No wonder these kids are freaking out and having these meltdowns. There's no safe place for them to just land and chill and be and learn. We are so far removed from traditional culture. And traditional culture around the world consumed really basic foods like fermented foods. They were eating sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, kefir across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, fermented fish sauces through Southeast Asia, miso in Japan. All of these foods preserved nutrients. They improved digestibility. They built the gut microbiome in ways that we're only just now beginning to understand in modern research. And a child can make sauerkraut. It's literally just cabbage and salt. You chop it up, you massage it, you pack it into a jar, you wait for it to start bubbling and fermenting. And in that waiting process, those kids are going to learn about microbiology because they're seeing it happen in live time. It's not some random fact that they're learning in a textbook. It's literally bubbles that are forming on the jar, on the counter. Kids are watching it. It's alive. It's taking its own shape. And as a child can see all of that and they can smell it and they can taste the change over the days, that's the type of education that you cannot get by watching a screen. So I'm going to give you another number, and I think that this is pretty important. And the number that I'm going to give you is 2 pounds, okay? 2 pounds of dried beans, it costs $2. That same amount of beans, 2 pounds, that are inside of cans that you purchase at the grocery store, is going to end up running you $8, $10, maybe $12 if you buy them in the can, already soaked, already ready to go. A loaf of bread, if you make a loaf of sourdough bread at home, it's going to cost you probably 50 cents in flour, a little bit of salt, water. That's it. But when you're buying it at the store, you're going to pay $6, $7, sometimes $11 if you're getting it from an artisanal baker. Then you take a chicken, okay? A roasted chicken can usually feed a family of 4 for like 3 to 4 different meals. When you eat the meat and then you make all of the broth from the bones, you render down the fat, you shred the leftovers into a soup. And your kids should know how to do all of this. They should see the math. It should actually empower them. And when a child understands that a kitchen can generate savings and stability and knowledge, then that's going to stick with them forever. There is a reason why these traditional food practices existed in every culture around the planet, every single one. The Inuit fermented fish and they had seal oil. The Maasai consumed fermented milk and blood. Scottish and Irish families kept crocks of perpetual bone broth on the hearth that they never even fully emptied. They just kept adding to it day after day, week after week. And the Japanese have been making miso for over 1,000 years with the exact same recipe over and over again. Salt, soybeans, a culture starter, and a little bit of time. These were survival strategies that evolved into very sacred practices. And what's wild is that modern science is only now just starting to catch up with what these grandmothers have known for hundreds of years. We're publishing studies in 2025 and 2026 about how fermented foods improve the gut and reduce inflammation. And meanwhile, there's this little Korean grandmother somewhere who's just like shaking her head in disbelief saying, yeah, we've known that for like 3,000 years. There's a researcher, his name is Dr. Christopher Gardner, and he's based out of Stanford. He ran this study a few years ago, and they had one group that was eating really high fiber diets, and then they had this other group that was eating a super high fermented food diet. And the fermented food group ended up showing significantly increased gut microbiome diversity and reduced markers of inflammation. Increased diversity. So that's the goal. We want increased diversity inside of our stomach. That's what keeps us resilient. It is from foods that cost almost nothing to make at home. Yogurt, sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi. It's like the everyday kitchen stuff. And when your child massages that salt into cabbage and watches it transform over a week, then they end up participating in something that humans have been doing since before we even had written language. That's pretty powerful. And it costs you about $2 and maybe 20 minutes of your time to teach your child how to do that. Okay, so I just want to pause here because I have some news that I've actually been holding on to, and I'm really excited that I finally get to share it. In March, mid-March, we're going to be launching a new canning course through Wilder Space, and you can take it virtually from your own kitchen or wherever you're at in the world. You can come do it in person if you're in Santa Cruz with me. You can get your hands in the jars and get your little sticky fingers on and have the whole experience. But here is why I built this. I built it because everything that we're talking about today, all of this knowledge is slipping away from us. And canning is probably one of the most powerful places that you can start bringing it back. Because when you learn to can, you are learning patience. You're learning food science. You're learning how to read your food, how to trust your hands, how to build a pantry that is going to feed your family through any season. I built this class in a way that I wish that somebody would have taught me. I'm designing it so that it's just very basic steps that will